We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast of St. Louis on the Air, brought to you by University College at Washington University, with undergraduate and graduate programs part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. There is an academic and scientific community in this country that's concerned important data in the public interest controlled by the government is at risk. The fear is that policies, research, and data related to climate, energy, and other issues, especially those in conflict with administration positions, could be expunged. Imagine, for instance, if all the data gathered by the government on climate change were removed or destroyed. There's an effort underway to rescue and protect the data by downloading it and preserving it in safe storage. Joining me to talk about this is Aaron Addison, Director of Data Services at Washington University. Aaron, thanks for being with us.
Happy to be here.
Why is this data rescue necessary?
Well, I think people become concerned anytime there's a threat of putting a gap into the historical record. The topics that have been discussed more recently are around publicly collected data. This goes back even to colonial times when ships would keep logs of their whereabouts and the conditions of the sea at any given time. A lot of these things are stored for the historical record, and it's only recently that people have really begun to value what some of these records might mean. So if you fast forward to today, I think what we're seeing is just an extension of that concern that it's a difficult thing to reconcile. Am I going to want this data later? Do I need it right now? What is the cost, the effort of preserving it, and so forth? So I think it's not any one thing that you can put a finger on, but rather all those things.
When this issue first came to my attention, it was over expressions of concern that our own government might be expunging some of this information because it was contrary to the government policies. Does that sound right to you?
It's largely correct. I think anytime you have a single source or a single responsible party for the storage and or the accessibility of a data set, it becomes a point of concern, whether that's happening at the federal level, the state level, or even the local level. We see examples of that across the board. If some person decides, as there's a change in leadership at one of those levels, they may either not prioritize that and allocate resources to maintaining it, or they may have a different direction they want to go, which includes pulling all that data back. So it's definitely a point of concern because there are a lot of research projects, there are a lot of data-informed decisions that take place that rely on the availability and the accessibility of that data.
Yeah. You mentioned some examples you've had at various levels. Can you give me some of those examples?
Well, I think there was a big concern at the national level with the last administration change that some of these data sets would no longer be available. I think there are conversations currently going on. There's an open comment period, for example, right now with the U.S. Census Bureau about what data products will or won't be available during the next decennial census in 2020. And so those are things that people begin to rave the red flag and or become concerned about because of ongoing activities or the fear that somehow that data is being removed from the public record.
Has this happened before? I mean, we're talking about the most recent change of administrations. How about in the past? Has some data been lost through this process?
Absolutely. I think one of the most famous cases of missing data was in the 1960 census. There was a research project, I believe, at the University of Minnesota that went back to digitize the older pre-digital census documents. And they were able to replicate the entire 1960 census with the exception of Cook County, Illinois, which is, of course, Chicago, and those records are just simply gone. They don't exist anymore.
And if I remember correctly, 1960 was the year that John Kennedy was elected president, and many people said it was those ghost voters in Chicago that won him the election.
That's right.
Yeah. Any other kinds of examples?
Well, I think
non-census.
Yeah, I think outside of demographics, which there are a lot of records right now that are pointing to whether it's housing discrimination. Facebook was just named as using unfair practices with HUD recipients and decisions that were being made there. I think in social media, who owns the tweets? How long do the tweets last? and so forth as a matter of public record. There are a lot of decisions that go back and look at the patterns of those tweets. For example, a natural disaster. You may have people that are tweeting from a hurricane site in the U.S. or an earthquake in Mexico. How is that data going to be used? How long should it live? What is it in terms of the responsibility of retaining that data, preserving that data that we want to engage in, again, given that we have finite resources, finite human resources in addition to just money in order to make those things happen. So, we could also explore the domain of medicine and how long we want to keep records that were related to this study or that study. Were they superseded by new work, and what is the relative nature of that data, and where should we keep it if we're not going to keep it in one place?
Are there any laws or policies or regulations that would prohibit the destruction of some of these data?
I think there are guidelines more than there are laws, and there's also just historical convention of we've always done it this way. And I think for data in particular, that's an area that hasn't really been covered well in legislation, to say that we are going to keep these things. There are broader laws that say, locally Sunshine Act laws, where we might be able to demand that a piece of data be made available if it was collected with taxpayer dollars, let's say. But at the federal level, there is a website called data.gov. What gets posted there, the timeliness of what gets posted there, the completeness of what gets posted there, I think, to be fair, is very uneven.
Why is this data posted on government.gov? Is it for people like you or researchers?
Sure. I mean, anyone can go there and download those data sets. Now, there are some that are subject to additional scrutiny. So what you may get when you go to the site and to the data layer is a connection or a piece of contact information that says, oh, if you want this piece of data, you need to go over to this person and ask them and articulate what your need is.
Is it fair to assume that if we wanted to, you wanted to, you could peel that onion and get all of the data connected to something like, let's say, climate change?
Sure. I mean, whatever's available is available. And so if you want to marshal the resources and build your own servers and store all that information, there's nothing to keep you from doing that. And that, in fact, was the data rescue efforts that began last year, was kind of this forklift exercise of we're going to grab everything. I think where a lot of those efforts kind of got stalled was, how do you maintain that now? You have everything that was extant. How are you going to move forward and maintain all the iterative updates? And that's where it gets a lot more complicated.
Well, you said you could get all of the data that was available. I suppose some of it could not be available, that for security reasons, or you name it, it just wouldn't be out there in any form.
That's right. And so some of the data is simply not available for security reasons. Other pieces of data may only be available as a derivative data set. In other words, you can't have access to the raw data. One area where we see things like that would maybe be in job numbers or economic data that's been adjusted for normalcy, but you're not ever going to be able to see that raw data.
So the government, and I really hesitate to even bring this up, but it's sort of a frightening specter. If the government wanted to, it could keep key data from people like you.
Possibly. I think that's been perhaps a little overblown, but it's still a point of concern. And again, I think anytime you're going to see a single point of failure where all roads lead to the same repository, that's problematic on many different levels. So we kind of have a saying that says lots of copies keep stuff safe. And so from that kind of paradigm, if you can distribute it out to different institutions, to the cloud, and things like this, it's going to have a lot better chance of remaining available than it might otherwise have. But of course, that costs money.
Yeah. The data rescue thing, as you pointed out, really got started a year or so ago, a little more than a year ago. And I think the temptation would be to try to relate that to the Trump administration. You alluded to the fact that there was an administration change. Is that fair?
I think it's just the latest example. I think these things have gone on for a long time. Is it more so now? Is it the same? I think history will be the judge of that. I think there are a lot of moving pieces to that. And it's not to say that we should always collect the same amount of information we've always, ascribed to in the past. But here we have a case where it's not happening in a vacuum. It's in concert with all of these other decisions that the administration is making. And so it adds certainly to the concern.
Well, let's go back then to when all of this started at Washington U, most recently anyway. Tell us about the data rescue plan as it has evolved at WashU.
Sure. So we maintain an archive of data that many people would not be interested in for a variety of reasons. For example, we maintain historical aerial photos of the St. Louis region as a record of change over time. Our architecture and our social work students are very interested in that, to see how a particular area of the city perhaps has changed, and they'll use that data to do different types of exploration and development ideas within the region.
If I can interrupt for just a second,
sure.
Where would that data have come from?
That data would have likely come from our participation in a regional consortium of entities that all work together to document the St. Louis area, okay. But as recently as 5 years ago, that data would have come from the federal government through grant funding that was sunset before the Trump administration, but certainly is being continued because there are a lot of other resources for that type of information now.
Mm. Okay, I interrupted. Go ahead with regard to that.
Sure.
Aerial photos.
Sure. So our aerial photo collection is just one example of a local data set that we would be involved with. I think more broadly, what we saw happen during the data rescue event were different institutions took different parts. You can imagine the task of trying to just head on absorb all of the information and data that the federal government has. Mm-hmm. And there's no one institution that can tackle that. And so different communities kind of bubbled up from that. And they would say, okay, we're going to work on the demographic data. We're going to work on the natural science data. And in doing that, they were able to have a more collective effort in terms of rescuing this data, or at least making another copy of it.
Yeah. So how does all of this work? I mean, you've got students, I guess, primarily involved in this. Just illustrate for us how you retrieve this data.
So it's kind of not very glamorous. It's a brute force activity for the most part. Some of it can be scripted and what we call scraped or downloaded automatically from the internet and various resources. But it involves some students. It involves a lot of library staff that are very dedicated towards these types of activities and understand the longitudinal nature of some of these data sets and the importance of keeping it intact for prosperity. So I think those are things that are unseen and aren't very glamorous, but can be very valuable efforts in and of themselves.
And where is the data stored?
So the data would be stored, again, this is a community effort, so it's not stored in any one place. There's no one place that you could go and just say, okay, if we pull the plug here, we can remove the existence of this data set. And again, that's a combination of institutional repositories, but also cloud resources are put into play to distribute that data and keep it from having a single point of failure.
Is there a master catalog? So if Joe Blow from Kokomo wants to find out something, can he go someplace and have an index of what's out there?
I don't think you would find it as such. I think different institutions do a very good job of documenting what they have in their holdings. But part of this effort is each institution making their own contributions to that and cataloging what they have. And so it would take someone, some level of effort to do that currently. Having said that, there are projects that would like to make this master catalog of what's available, but those efforts are slow going for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of data. It's stored in different formats, and all those things have to kind of come together. And it takes a very dedicated person over many years to even begin to address that.
Well, the reason you're doing this is to preserve data. How do you secure what data that you have downloaded? So
we use a strategy, and this is a strategy that listeners can use at home as well, of 3-2-1. And so the the practice suggests that you want to have at least 3 copies of your data on 2 different types of media, and one of those should be off-site. So you're guarding against disk failure, computer failure, but you're also guarding against physical destruction of that disk through fire, flooding, and those types of things. And I think when you look at industries, you look at individuals who really want to have their data, and it's very important, if not critical, to their livelihood, they'll follow those practices. Unfortunately, most of us as individuals, we don't. We may have these cryptically named folders that have all of these digital photos in them, but nobody knows what they are. We never curated them. We never went through and took out the ones that weren't important to us, which is a different thing in this day and age than even it was when I was growing up 20 or 30 years ago, because I could pull out a photo and my grandmother or my mother had written on the back who was in the photo. We don't even do that anymore. And so there's this gap that's forming in our family record, and that's unfortunate.
Well, we have many authors on this program, and what they tell us, historians in particular depend on letters. And now there are no letters. It's all email and texting and what have you. That's
very true. What does your mother's handwriting look like if all you ever got from her were texts?
Yeah. Does digital data degrade over time?
It does. And so you can have mechanical things happen, disk damage. You can have what's called bit flipping, where ones turned into zeros and vice versa under certain conditions. The disks that are mechanical have parts that wear out. And so, it's not unlike a light bulb in a lot of ways. It's not a matter of if the light bulb is going to burn out. It's just a matter of when.
Well, what do you do about that?
Well, this is where it's important to have these backups. And if you've done your due diligence and you've implemented a strategy like 3-2-1, then you'll be covered against any single point of failure.
And this data we're talking about is stored on a 3-2-1 basis?
It is, or even systems and methodologies that are more robust than that. And so those data sets would be stored probably on at least 2 different servers, but they would also be backed up on magnetic tape. There might be, in some instances, a copy on another machine at a cooperating or a colleague's computer at another institution for certain types of data. And in even other cases, it may even have a copy that lives on Amazon or on Box or Dropbox or one of these services.
Is there some mechanism for monitoring this stuff to see if it is in fact degrading?
It is. Degrading? So we run a series of steps against our data sets, and this is the topic of data curation. Is what's there, what's supposed to be there, really there, and is it really intact? And could we really recover from it? And I unfortunately see a lot of projects that never test their backups. And so whenever the day comes that they really do have a problem, what they thought was there on their backup isn't. And this is to your point, is why it's so important. We run fixity checks. Is the data been corrupted? We run checks against the health of the hardware. We monitor the temperature of the computer. And if any of those things become out of range, then we're notified. And that's a flag that we need to take action at that point.
I'm assuming that Washington University is not the only institution that's doing this sort of thing.
Absolutely not. I would say, all, if not, 95, 98% of them are doing this kind of thing.
There again, it just boggles my mind to think of what kind of coordination there would have to be, and repetition. A lot of you folks doing the same thing.
Absolutely. And in some cases, institutions, for a variety of reasons, are maybe doing the same thing for their own reasons, much in the same way that you can imagine if you went to 10 research institutions across the country, they may all 10 have the same book on the shelf. So there are reasons why you would want to have the availability of that data. But in other cases, these communities do interact. And again, the example that I can use is the library community, the librarians, the data staff, the technical staff at these institutions. They're a pretty tight-knit community, and they're very dedicated to making sure that this happens.
You indicated earlier on that there were some problems in continuing the data rescue work that you've been doing. What is the status of it now?
So I think it's like anything. There's a big swell of activity at the beginning, and then it tends to tail off over time. The big need there was you had this enormous amount of data that were on these websites, everything from the Library of Congress to the EPA to the Department of Energy and data.gov I mentioned earlier. How do we just start on this process and then give ourselves some breathing room in terms of figuring out what's a long-term solution to this? And so you're really working on two different dimensions. One that's very short-term, what do we do if they turn this off tomorrow? And one that's more long-term is how do we sustain this effort? If we're serious about saying we want to have multiple copies of this data, how are we actually going to make that happen?
When you say they might turn this off tomorrow, who is the they you're talking about?
So I think it's just researchers that sounded an alarm that may or may not have been warranted at the level of noise that was provided. But it was sufficient to raise the awareness to say, hey, regardless of what the current administration is, this is probably not an ideal makeup and single point of failure for these important data sets, regardless of that.
How much data is in storage now? How would you describe what's out there?
It's remarkable, and it's hard to even come to terms with. Most people have heard of megabytes, gigabytes, possibly terabytes, but there's like another 5 or 6 levels that go above that. Words like zettabyte and petabyte, and I think we have individual projects that are generating petabytes of data. And so whenever you start to pull all that together, what you come to terms with realistically is that it's not possible to archive all of it. And so this is, again, where curation comes into play. And an analogy I can to reuse, if you'll allow me, is that not all books can be stored in the library. There's a finite amount of shelf space in a library, and we have to make decisions about what we want to have on the shelf and what we don't. And that conversation extends to data as well.
Well, who's making the decisions?
So I don't think it's any one person. I think in some domains they're really good at coming together as a community and making those decisions. I think in other areas you have librarians that are involved in helping to make those decisions. But in no case that I'm aware of do you have individuals that are making those decisions, which I think is a much healthier way to go about it.
What is the difference between data rescue and data harvesting that we're hearing so much about with regard to Facebook and Google and places like that?
So functionally, I don't know that the process is any different. I think that the purpose and the reasons behind it are quite different. In data rescue, typically we're not rescuing that data for ourselves, but we're rescuing that as a part of the historical record or for someone else to use at a later point. Data harvesting, I think, is where you begin to see social media, search engine companies like Google and Microsoft and others are pulling that data together to enhance their business practices. They're harvesting that data and they're bringing it to target ads to the user to connect them with other people in areas like LinkedIn is a good example of that. But the use cases are very different. One is monetizing it, and the other is just saying, hey, I'm not sure it's a good idea for one person to be in control of all this.
As someone who lives in this world, what do you make out of where we are right now in all of this?
I think it's uncertain times. I think that there's a lot of this book that's left to be written. Some of that is related to the economics of the situation. Some of it is more related to policy. What is it that we want to allow companies to keep and to harvest about us? What is it that we want to prioritize in terms of much wider data sets that maybe I don't have a vested interest in, but I still want there to be that historical climate record available to anyone that wants to be able to use it. And so that's a matter of prioritizing. And, there's a lot of that hasn't happened yet, and we're in the midst of. And I think we'll look back on these days in the future as kind of the wild, wild west period of anything goes. As long as you could pull the resources together, you could make it happen.
The issue of privacy, of course, is a considerable one in all of this. Just a quick story. I'd like to get your reaction to it. My son has an Alexa, and the other day he was wakened by the machine just shouting his name out of nowhere. I mean, no one was awake, and then Alexa was just calling his name. What the heck? I mean, that's scary.
It is.
Yeah.
And so, these are the things that you sign up for. whenever you agree to, or you in some cases pay to use that technology, are these rough edges around it as it's being developed. That sounds like a bug probably in their software. And is that really something that you want to be a part of your life?
Yeah. Well, we'll backtrack a little bit here. What is your best advice to John Q. citizen about preserving their own data? You've already alluded to that, what they should do, and protecting their own privacy.
I think just to be aware, not to go through the automatic check boxes without paying attention to what you're signing up for, especially with apps and social media. Mm-hmm. It may be a game that you want to download for your kid, but you inadvertently allowed them access to your contacts or to your phone records or something on your device. So I think being aware of what you're doing is always going to be the best. There's no way to just totally shut it off unless you want to not use Google, not use a smartphone, and not engage in society in that way. You can certainly reduce most effectively in that manner, but that's not something that I see a lot of people willing to go to that length in order to protect their privacy. And to be fair, my daughters who are teenagers have a different concept of privacy than I do. I have a different concept than my parents do. And so there's definitely a generational thing here as well that ultimately could even impact things like HIPAA. What is it to have medical privacy? Yeah. And is that as important to the generation that comes after me as it was to me or to my parents?
Well, I know that all of my medical records are out there because, the medical professionals today like to do it that way. And if you want to check on, tests and that sort of thing, it is there. The genie is out of the bottle in all of this.
I think you're right on that respect. And that's why, I go back to just be informed, be aware of the decisions you're making. Don't stick your head in the sand. Don't assume that whoever you're interacting with has your best interest in mind. They most likely have different alignment to different incentives than what you have. And just being aware is where you want to be.
Rules, regulations, and legislation will catch up eventually.
We hope so.
I want to thank you so much for being with us, Aaron Addison of Washington University. Fascinating stuff. It's interesting times, as the Chinese say. We live in interesting times.
That's right.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.